mutual reception can be harmonious or it can be negative mutual reception. But it's basically whenever one planet falls in the essential dignities of another planet and vice versa. So, for example, if you have Jupiter in Virgo, which is the home of Mercury, and Mercury in Sagittarius, which is the home of Virgo, you have these planets in mutual reception. But it's discordant mutual reception because we know that they are opposite. Sagittarius is opposite of Mercury's home in Gemini, and Virgo is opposite of the home. So they're in one another's detriment, basically. But because they're in one another's sign, there is a relationship that's being set up. Another case in point might be, let's say, the Sun is in Leo and Uranus is in Aquarius. So here you've got well, no, that wouldn't work. The opposite. Yeah. The Sun is in Aquarius and Uranus is in Leo. So you've got each planet falls in one another's sign, so there is a resonance that is set up between those planets. But, again, they are both falling in their detriment, being in the sign opposite their home. Nevertheless, they're in mutual reception with one another. Another combination could be, let's see, well, let's say Venus in Aries and Mars in Taurus. So Venus is in the home sign of Mars. Mars is in the home sign of Venus. So they again are in mutual reception.
Don't they have to be in pretty much the same degree?
They don't.
They don't?
No.
Really? That's what I was taught. See, it's another one of those things.
And, you know, Johanna, every astrologer you go to will teach you something else. It isn't a standardized system, which is why I always say find a system, really work with it till you're good, and then start bringing in other systems. Because if one starts studying 3 or 4 or 5 different authors or systems at the same time, okay, yeah, it becomes it can become confusing.
Oh, definitely.
Because there's
cardinal signs and movable signs,
which are the same thing.
which is the same thing, just different.
Yeah.
Different language.
Yeah, it is. But that's an easy one to adapt to. There's so much else out there that is, a challenge to work with. You had a question, Bettina?
Yes. How does that play out in a chart?
Basically, it plays out in a chart. Normally, if it's a harmonious mutual reception, it'll allow a little bit of energy. Does anybody have last week's handouts? Because I'll actually read to you the other sheet that I gave out on essential dignities. That one. Here you go. All right. Let's see, degree of exaltation. Maybe it's not in here.
It's not in the other one? I know it said one.
Mutual reception. All right. When one planet is in the home sign or exaltation sign of the other planet, at the same time the other planet is in the home sign or exaltation sign of this planet, the resonance thus created tends to be the most harmonious of any due to the sign positions of the planets. Such sign relationships between planets is called mutual reception. Observation indicates that the departments of life ruled by these houses, occupied by planets, thus in mutual reception, tend to markedly assist each other. Planets do not need to be in aspect with each other to be in mutual reception. So in a sense, these planets will assist one another. If even though Uranus is at its detriment in Leo, and the sun is at its detriment in Aquarius, suddenly there is a more harmonious energy present when they're in one another's home sign. And so in that case, the qualities of the sun, which might have to do with leadership, authority, male sex in general, and the qualities of Uranus, which have to do with originality and inventiveness and combined together in a way. They're sort of pooling their resources with one another, and that can create for greater, inventiveness. It can create for somebody who's able to find new ways of satisfying their self-esteem. Let's say that if the moon was in Moon is in Capricorn. It is its opposite sign, and Saturn was in Cancer. Normally those aren't good positions, but having both of them in their detriment allows for a more harmonious expression for each of those signs. So Saturn in Cancer, rather than being, both Saturn and Cancer can have a dampening effect on one's emotions, emotional self-expression. The same as the moon in Capricorn, because when the moon's in Capricorn, one is holding their feelings in reserve. But chances are with that combination, there's a little more freedom, and they're not necessarily going to get up on top of the piano and dance. That may not be that person, but it might be somebody who is able to perhaps better define what they're feeling or what they're going through, rather than to just shut it down and no, there's nothing wrong with me. They might actually be able to articulate that. So, yeah, mutual reception's interesting, and it's hard to, pull it up in one's head, but it's always great when we can look at a chart and discover that. So, for example, the chart that's up here, this chart which is pictured, there's a mutual reception between Uranus and the moon. How is that possible? It's possible because here, Uranus is falling in the sign of the moon, even though the moon is not in the sign of the other. The moon's not in Aquarius, it's in Capricorn, but nevertheless, with Uranus in the moon sign, there is a resonance set between those planets.
So from last week's...
And they're not in aspect to one another either.
Okay.
Welcome, class number 3. This is the midpoint in this series of classes. So there's 2 left after tonight. This particular series of classes is a smorgasbord of astrological techniques, just to get you familiar with a variety of the tools we use in astrology. So tonight's class is going to be on progressions. It's titled Hermetic Progressions, but in tonight's class I want to really, because of the amount of time we have, focus on major progressions. And we will, at the end of class, we're going to actually look at a chart and I'm going to go to the computer and pull it up, and we're going to track progressions through the life events of an individual. Now, this is a technique I highly recommend for oneself. I have the advantage in my life, I've always been a record keeper, especially in the last 40 years when I decided there was a reason to keep records, which is to actually test if progressions work. So, if you can remember significant dates in your life and write them down, what one can do later is go back and look at the chart and see what was happening. The best way to get your predictive skills or your forecasting skills in astrology is by building up case histories, either being able to follow along in your own chart and see how progressed aspects have expressed themselves, or following the charts of family members, friends, or what we do, looking at the charts of celebrities, where we actually have access to the dates and times of events in their lives because there are written records kept, and oftentimes we're going to have more accurate access to the dates and events in celebrities' lives than we will have in our own lives. The Chinese have a saying, which is the palest ink is more powerful than the strongest memory. So writing something down is a much more reliable source than just going by memory. Now, let's talk about progressions. A progression is basically the act of progressing. To progress means that we're moving forward. So this is an onward movement. What this means in astrology is it is any variety of methods of comparing the natal chart to subsequent planetary positions in order to establish an optimum time to accomplish things or to establish the probable time an event occurred or will occur. So, timing is everything, and progressions are the method in astrology that we use to see the timing of events. Now, what Zane says is, astrology does not foreshadow events which are inevitable. It maps thought cell activities which influence the thoughts and behavior and exert extra physical power on the environment in such a way as to make certain events probable. That comes from Progressing the Horoscope. So it's not the planets moving things around like chess pieces on Earth. It is the planets which, within our soul, within our subconscious, within our unconscious mind, the planetary energies at different periods in our lives are impinging on us in such a way that they stimulate us to feel in certain ways, to think in certain ways, and then our activities follow that, or due to what is called psychokinetic energy, the ability of the mind to manipulate matter. We are in a certain framework of thinking that it draws certain trends or events to us from outside of us. Yes?
So are progressions kind of like an unfolding of the pattern that's kind of in our DNA?
Absolutely. Though in this case, it's the unfolding of the pattern that's in your spiritual DNA. And that's a very good point, which we will talk about tonight when we discuss how we interpret this stuff. Because what I constantly try to remind students is that when we try to interpret progressions, we always have to go back to the natal chart. Because the natal chart shows us the pattern. How does this individual habitually think, feel, and behave? And therefore, under particular pressure or stress or added energy, how will that person think, feel, and act? So in Hermetic astrology, the natal chart represents the most powerful influences which impact our character, our consciousness, and determine our life experiences. What progressions are is from the time of birth forward, planets continue to move. And throughout our lives, they are forming relationships, both between one another by this progressed movement, and they're forming relationships to the planets in the chart of birth. What happens is these progressed aspects create what we will call temporary astral weather conditions. Now remember, the word astral means of a star. And the causation we feel, the way that astrology works, is that there is a plane of being where our soul resides, where our unconscious mind resides. Our bodies live in the physical plane. This soul or subconscious exists in an astral plane. So it's in that realm, which is internal to the physical, moves at a velocity higher than the physical. Things happen there before they happen in this slower moving physical substance. So if we can observe and look in advance at those weather conditions, we can get a pretty good idea of what the likelihood is of certain events. So what happens is these conditions impinge upon the soul, and that is what stimulates us into thinking, feeling, and acting in very specific ways. Those specific ways we know are based on the influence of the planets. Yes?
Is it kind of like how they measure tremors in the ground to predict an earthquake?
Well, we'll say that it's similar. The way that tremors are measured are used with a seismograph. And this is a very delicate instrument that can pick up on vibrations happening around the world. The same thing, to some degree, in the hands of a skilled astrologer. The difference is, with the seismograph, it cannot pick up on what is going to happen. It can only pick up on what has happened. And if you ever look at the paper readouts from seismographs, you've got these going on. And what the astrologer does is it's looking at the seismograph of your soul, but because the time and space operate differently on the inner plane, one can look forward to see what those, very similarly, what those patterns are going to be like in the future. And that's the difference. The thing with earthquake forecasting, they can't see further down the roll, which hasn't unrolled yet and hasn't been inked yet.
So
Whereas
they
with,
often make predictions.
they do based on the patterns that are already in place of the vibrations that are being felt deep within the Earth's surface. So what happens is, again, using this psychokinetic model that basically we attract what we think or we attract what we feel. If that energy is strong enough, it in turn draws in events and experiences from our environment. So, progressions are this technique where we're not only able to see what's gone on in the past, what's happening now, but we can see what the future trends are. By knowing what's happened in the past and how the individual is behaving currently. That is what gives us the information to make predictions. So, some examples are progressions tell us whether we're going to have, in certain periods of our life, sunshine or storms with our health, whether we might have windfalls or losses economically, times in our life where we might either make relationships or break off relationships. Numerous other types of activities can be determined through this process. Hermetic astrology uses 3 types of progressions. We use major progressions, which is what I'm going to focus in on tonight. We use what are called minor progressions, and we use transits. Most astrological students, and many astrologers I've met, work only with transits. And there is a reason for that, because they are the easiest to calculate. Now, with computer programs, majors and minors can be calculated within seconds. There are handouts on the table, Laura, if you could get someone to hand one back to you. All right, what does the word major mean? Might be someone in the military, but it means the big guy. And minor might be somebody under 21, or, hey. Or a minor might mean something lesser. Can't vote yet. So,
Something different if you were reading it in music.
True, but that would be a lower key, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it
A lesser key? So, we have majors, minors, and transits, and they are each calculated differently. Major progressions, the basic rule of thumb is major progressions are a year for a day. What this means is that every day after birth is equal to a year in an individual's life. This would mean that each 2 hours after birth, the movement of the planets during that period of time is equal to 1 month in an individual's life. And every 4 minutes after birth are equivalent to 1 day of life. And what we're looking at is inner plane frequencies. And I want to describe to you an experience I had a couple of years ago. I woke up in the middle of the night, looked at the time, decided it wasn't time to get up yet, and that I was going back to sleep. I went back to sleep, and I dreamt a day's worth of activities from start to finish. And I woke up and I thought, oh my God, I must have slept in. I must have overslept. I looked at the clock. It was 4 minutes later. So on the astral plane, 4 minutes, that is going at a vibratory level where 4 minutes of our time there is the equivalent to 1 day. So that's roughly. Now, when you sit down, those of you who learned astrology in the good old days where we had to calculate everything by hand would know that calculating progressions is a piece of work.
Yay, I'm advantaged.
You're advantaged. Which is why many astrologers worked with transits, because transits we'll actually get to that in a moment. So major progressions, when we're looking at a chart, if we're looking at a 2-wheeled chart, the inner wheel is the natal chart, and the outer wheel is the major progressions. And generally on that chart, we make a note of what day the chart is progressed to. It's a very good thing to have. So there you have the outer wheel. Now, in order to determine the strength of a major progression to attract events, we give the major progression the value or the power. In the case of astrology and in Hermetic astrology, we're working with astrodynes, star power basically, or astrological power. And so we give a major progression the equivalent of 1/2 the power that that planet might have in the natal chart. And therefore, we consider the major events that come into one's life are signified by major progressions in the chart. What we look at, hey, Wanel, you may have to unfold a chair. They're behind Laura, or there's one up here, or you can take the banco, which is extraordinarily uncomfortable. So what we're looking at is the progressed placement of the planets, the nature of the aspect which they form. We look at the natal positions of those planets, and we look for each of those planets, how were they conditioned at birth? What is the relative power, the harmony, and the discord of those planets in the natal chart? This gives us clues in interpretation. The other thing we look at is the houses they govern by rulership. So we look not only to the houses they are in by progression, what they govern in the natal chart, and by rulership, for example, if we were looking at Pluto, we'd go to the outer cusp of the chart to find the sign of Scorpio. And that would also tell us that this progressed aspect has the potential to stimulate that house in the chart. So, what's that a picture of? It's an antenna, a radio tower. If you drive up on North 4th, you'll see some of these, and in other places around town.
Cell phone towers look like that too.
Yes, though that now they're very successful at disguising them as the most unusual looking trees I've ever seen.
I would laugh if somebody tried to climb it.
So, a antenna can also be called, or a tower could be called, an aerial. And there are aerials which are sending out radio frequencies, but anyone that has a radio, in the old days, cars had antennas on them. Or if you had a little transistor radio, you'd have this telescoping antenna that you would pull. Yes, those are great to have. You'd pull that out in order for it to receive radio waves. So the way we like to describe progressions in Hermetic astrology is that they are temporary stellar aerials, because each planet moves at a different speed, which means that these aspects can be an orb from a period of time anywhere from months to 12 years to a lifetime. Now, while these are, we call this an orb, when an aspect is within 1 degree of entering aspect and separating from progressed aspect, it's called orb. So during that period, this is where we have the unusual activity. What this means is, depending on the planets involved, progressions have specific dates when they enter, specific dates when they reach their peak of power, or when we say the aspect has become perfect, and they have specific dates when they leave. In interpreting progressions, though this is loose, we generally look at it from the perspective that as an aspect is applying, from the moment it enters aspect to the time it reaches its peak of energy, we consider the energy to be building, or that it has greater power to attract events. Once it has reached that peak of power and is moving towards separating, we consider it being less able to attract events, but nevertheless, from the time that aspect enters to the time it leaves, we consider that the window of opportunity. Yes?
Doesn't, in progressions, don't you just only have a 1 degree window of aspect?
We do, and that was where? 1 degree orb of aspect.
Are you only talking about some progressions?
If solars are what the name you give to major progressions or secondary progressions. If solar progressions means something else, then we're probably not talking about them.
1 day for a year.
Yes, day for a year. Yeah.
You said earlier that basically how the first days of your life are will kind of determine the rest of the years of your life.
Yeah.
Well, what if you almost died as a baby?
You know, that could certainly have its impact, though we're looking less at the physical events that happened as we are to the inner plane events that happened.
Oh, okay.
What was going on in the incubation of that soul at that time?
If you had a crappy time as a baby, you're going to have it for the rest of your life?
You know, not necessarily.
Okay, good.
But, you know, some people get...
used to eat for the first couple months.
Yeah. Some people get very attached to their life patterns, and they make them sort of self-replicating, which is, again, why astrology works, because astrology is based on pattern. So if we can observe how somebody has behaved in the past under a particular pattern, then we know the direction that events will trend in their life unless they do something particular to change it. That's where the willpower comes in. It's that decisive action.
And sometimes what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's for the rest of your life.
Yes, almost always. Unless it just beats you down, yes. And you know, sometimes repeated blows, one after another, can weaken an individual. But if one is allowed periods of recuperation between traumatic events, then generally the soul strengthens. And that's on different levels, not just in terms of physical...
People would disagree.
Right.
Shoshana, the birth chart is a promise of becoming. It's only the beginning. So this, when you reach progressions, then you have a whole different set of things to work with.
I see.
Yet there are some people who are, I've known some people with physical disabilities that have lived very bitter, sorry, angry lives, and I've known others that have gone on to excel in whatever abilities they do have, and to perfect those more, and to still extract meaning and beauty and joy from life. And the only difference between them has generally been the attitude of the individual. So I think what we direct our wills towards multiplies in our lives. Yes, Laura?
Technical question. Are majors the same as solar arc progression?
No.
That's what I thought, that you were referring to solar progressions and... I know the term solar arc, but I don't really understand it.
We do progress the midheaven by solar arc, which means that when we progress the midheaven, it always moves at the same speed that the sun is moving. But if solar arc would mean that every progression, every planet would move forward at 1 degree a year.
And this is only the sun.
Correct, because that is the rate that the sun moves every day, 59 minutes. The moon, on the other hand, moves 13 degrees in a day. So in a year of progressions, the moon will have moved 13 degrees from the start of the year to the end of the year. So what we look at is, we say that every progression stimulates, this is the mantra, 4 or more areas in the chart. Of those 4 areas, we have the natal house positions of both planets, where they were at birth. So in the case of this, we're looking at a progressed aspect involving the Sun and Jupiter. At this time in this chart, the Sun had progressed up. I'm at an angle, so I can't read that. Is that 28 Capricorn?
28 degrees.
Virgo. And here we have 23. So that's 23 Virgo. Here, by progression, we have 23 Capricorn. What is the nature of that aspect? Virgo to Capricorn? They're in the same element, so it's a trine. Same degree of the same element, Earth, trine. But what we look at to see, okay, what's going on during this aspect in someone's life? Well, where are the planets in the natal chart? 12th house and the 6th house. Then we want to look and see where is the position of the planets by progression. We can see that Jupiter doesn't move very far. So it takes Jupiter about 12 years to move a degree. Actually, it takes it half that time, 6 years to move a degree by major progression. Yeah. So Jupiter is also in the same house it was at birth, but the Sun progresses at 1 degree basically every year. So we can see that the Sun has progressed forward from the degree it was at birth to where it was in the progressed chart. So we're looking at events that are stimulating 12th house activity. Somebody tell me what the 12th house governs. Hidden?
Secret enemies.
Secret enemies.
Banks,
Institutions.
murder.
Okay, we've done good at hitting most of the negative connotations of that sign. What would the positive connotations of the 12th?
Absolute guidehouse, perfection, the muses, intuition.
I call it inner space. Instead of exploring outer space, when the 12th house is active, we tend to explore inner space, our inner world, our subconscious, our symbol sets, anything that can tap us in more to the divine or to feel more inspired. So it can be the darkest of the dark night of the soul and one's addictions and undoing. It is confinement. It is institutions. And institutions can be places such as hospitals, prisons, jails, which are usually involuntary. Some people do have the good sense to check themselves into hospitals when they need it, but for the most part, you're taken there by ambulance.
Well,
However,
Capricorn on the 12th house, though, it's a pretty dark place to be.
not with Jupiter there.
Yeah, Jupiter.
The planets in the house have more strength than the planets on the cusp. But going back, hold on, Barb. The other institutions, well, military can be an institution, but there are things such as monasteries, ashrams, retreats, spas. I mean, we don't think of going to the spa as a unpleasant experience. These are also private, away places where we go for retreat. Barb, you had a comment. Someone online or?
Yeah, your online people are wondering because they don't have a copy of what you're talking about.
Just follow along. Don't worry about it. We'll do more of this later with the chart you have on hand. I didn't actually expect to spend this much time on this particular chart. So just hang in there with us since you can't see it that clearly. Winnell?
I've always thought of it sort of as the cosmic soup, like the ocean. It's the priest and the commoners. I mean, it's that duplicity of everything that human nature can hold. So that's why it's so nebulous and washes away.
Well, it's also nebulous because in a natural chart, it's ruled by Pisces, for which the chief ruler is Neptune. So, which the worst quality of Neptune is vagueness. Yes.
Spiritual stuff, psychic stuff, it rules. That's what I
Right, and all of that is stuff that we have a very hard time proving because science wants things that are provable with the physical senses aided by instrumentation. And, to prove your dreams to someone else you're hard-pressed to do that. So, then what we look at is the house each planet co-rules determined by the sign on the cusp of the house. What does the sun rule?
Leo, 5th house,
And Jupiter?
Sagittarius,
And?
the 9th house.
9th and 12th.
Well, this is the 11th house.
Actually, the Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces. So it's going to stimulate the 11th house and the 2nd house. And the sun governs Leo, which means it will stimulate the 7th house. So under this progressed trine of the sun to Jupiter, this individual is going to have experiences that are, whatever you called it, the cosmic soup. The inner stuff is going to be stimulated, which has to do with both privacy and intuition or feelings of restriction or confinement. Their work is going to be influenced because natally the sun is in the 6th house. Other people's money will be influenced because it's progressed into the 8th house. By the same token, friendships, groups, and organizations can be brought into activity under this aspect, as can one's finances.
Why does this guy sound like a con artist?
Because it could be true or it could be your interpretation. Because we all take in information through our filters.
Given that Jupiter is activating both the 12th and the 11th, could it mean private matters coming to light in a public fashion? Exposure?
Well, it could. And what this chart, for those of you who are online, some of you may have this chart. It's actually President Obama's chart, which was progressed to the day that he won the first election some 5 years ago. November of whatever that year was, 2000.
He had to come to terms with his private life becoming a public affair.
Right. And being president also has a lot to do with duty and confinement. You can't go anywhere without 16 men around you.
Especially other people's money.
Right, because you can't become president without campaign donations, other people's money. His employment was affected, the sixth house, his sense of work, but also if we look at the planets, the sun has to do with power, self-esteem, authority. We consider it to be the king or the ruling individual, whether it's the president of a country or a president of a corporation. At the time, we think of a trine as being a luck factor and Jupiter as being benevolence. So what happened was somewhat unexpected that
The 12th house, too, you can become an icon. You can become bigger than life. And so to have the Jupiter trining your sun, it's like he was promoted as bigger than life. This is the Savior. I mean, that first political campaign was this is hope.
Change.
right,
Change.
hope.
Jupiter wasn't it? No, it's not opposite the sun.
So that lengthy discussion was merely just to show you that whenever you have any aspect, there are what? 4 or more points. You have natal positions, progressed positions, and the houses which have on their cusp the sign or signs that those planets rule. All of those areas of your chart can be stimulated with any one progressed aspect. So, we can already see that when we go into interpreting these things, we have to look at a lot of things, or we have to just go with what we're inspired to say, what strikes us at that moment, or you'll never get through a reading. So, this is what a progressions report looks like. Yes, those of you online, I imagine this is just one blur to you, but don't worry about it. We'll work in theory, and then towards the end of the class, we're going to do our hands-on experience of looking at a chart. But basically what's happening here, we can list aspects chronologically. And when we look at a progressions report, they're numbered. You set up parameters. I'd like to know between this date and this date what aspects are in orb. So this column will show you when the aspect entered. Those are the dates when they enter. Here's a view that's easier to see. Planet enters. The date it becomes perfect. And the date it leaves orb. That's how we read this. The aspect itself is here. Venus conjunct Uranus. The first planet is always the progressed planet. So we know that's always progressed. The second planet can be either natal or progressed. Well, you can guess easily that P means progressed. What does R mean? This is archaic, but it means radical. And that comes from somewhere in astrology where it was considered better to use R than N for natal. So, go figure. Just know that if it's an R, it means it's in the natal chart. If it is a progressed, you can have aspects from progressed planets to natal planets, or from progressed planets to other progressed planets.
Is the significance greater from the progressed planets affecting the natal than the progressed affecting the progressed?
Not at all. What is the differentiating factor in the emphasis of the event that is attracted? is the power of those planets in the natal chart. Welcome. There are some extra chairs behind Laura there if you want to pull one out and make room for yourself. I think we have one set of handouts left. So the power of the planets in the natal chart, and again, this is by Astrodynes. How much energy does that planet have in the consciousness of the individual to attract events? When it progresses forward, it still is going to be on that roll. There are aspects which have greater power than others. For example, conjunctions and oppositions are powerful aspects. Squares and trines and sextiles are next in power. Semi-squares, semi-sextiles, sesqui squares are considered to be moderate. So we're looking at that in determining how important of an event is this going to be. Because the power of the planet in the natal chart determines the amount of psychokinetic energy that aspect has to attract events into the individual's life. So we've just gone through this. First symbol is the planet forming the aspect. This is by progression. Second symbol is the aspect itself. And the third symbol, which is the aspect, the planet to which the aspect is being formed. And here we've talked about, is it progressed or is it radical, a planet in the natal chart?
Does it show there if it's aspecting a retrograde, progressed, or natal planet?
No, but it does in the chart itself. If you look at the wheel, there will be an R after any planet that is retrograde, either in the birth chart or the progressed chart. And since you have to look back at the chart wheel itself to determine what house positions are being stimulated, you should be able to readily pick that out. So, just to give you some idea in terms of the speed by progressions which planets move. The moon moves through all 12 houses and makes all possible aspects to the other planets in 27.3 years. Because its thought cells are so open an avenue for energy, its passage through each house in turn, averaging less than 2.5 years. This varies from chart to chart, from house to house. If you have intercepted signs, it takes longer for them to pass through those houses. But back to the quote. Its passage through each house in turn, averaging less than 2.5 years, tends to bring the thing signified by the department of life ruled by the house it is in at the time to the fore. In some manner, the popularity is apt to be affected by aspects involving the moon as it relates to the mentality. The temporary mood is indicated by the planet to which it makes a progressed aspect. Nevertheless, because the moon moves so quickly through a chart, we consider the events that it brings to be more of a sub-major event.
Question. What happens, though, when that progressed moon conjuncts the moon? In other words, it's like a lunar return.
You have a lunar return, and the matters of that area of your life are brought into the forefront of your attention. But basically, what's happening with if you imagine the chart wheel of 12 spokes, this is approximate, but the moon progresses through each house every 2.5 years. During that 2.5 year period, the matters of that house, whether it has to do with health, the physical body and personality, whether it has to do with your personal finances and or collections, the second house, whether it's third house, your studies, mental pursuits, relationships with your siblings and your car, or the fourth house, which is home, family, where you live, property, real estate. During those 2.5-year periods, that area of your life is subject to an emotional emphasis for you. And it's important to pay attention to that.
My progressed moon was in 1 degree of orb when my mother died.
Orb of what?
Of the moon. So it's like breast moon is less than 1 degree on that moon in the 7th house.
So chances are she either died when you were 28 or when you were 56.
You know how you look astrologically to see what was going on, and that was the strongest thing I could see.
All right, Zane says, because long observation indicates that on the average, a progress aspect made by the moon attracts an event only 1/7 as important as that attracted by a similar progressed aspect made by one of the other 11 positions. It is customary to designate major progressed aspects made by the moon as sub-major progressed aspects. Progressed aspects made by any of the other 11 positions to the birth chart moon, however, are on the average as powerful to attract events as those made to other birth chart planets. What he's saying here is the moon, as it moves forward, the moon remains in aspect to other planets for 2 months, basically. It's about 50, maybe 60 days. During that period of time, these are shorter-term events that are going on. However, the other planets, when they progress forward and make an aspect to the natal position of the moon, these are longer-term aspects, and they tend to bring more significant life events to the individual. Where this may hold difference is if perhaps in your chart the moon is your most powerful planet. And then you have to watch your moon progressions very carefully, because these signify, because that planet carries the bulk of your energy, these signify more significant events in your life. The other thing is, if the sign or the cusp of the house in which Cancer falls in your chart is ruled by the moon, and if there's no other planet in that house, then the only way that house is stimulated by progression is through the moon. So that quote is from Natal Astrology. In tonight's class, we're not going to really look at them, but I want to give you a little information, and that is Hermetic astrology also uses minor progressions. Now, major progressions are measured by the movement of the sun, which is 1 degree a day. Minor progressions are made or measured by the movement of the moon, which is approximately 27.25 days after birth is a complete moon cycle. So when we look at minor progressions, as I mentioned, major progressions are a day for a year after birth. Minor progressions are basically measured a month. One passage of the moon after birth is equivalent to a year. As the name implies, minor progressions are that, minor. They bring more minor events into one's life. And the movement of the moon through each sign of the zodiac after birth equals 1 month of life. The moon through each degree, 1 day of life. So, we decided that major progressions have about 1/2 the power of the energy in the natal chart. Minor progressions carry 1/8 the power of the natal chart. So these bring events to pass, but they are less significant than the events signified by major progressions. However, greater significance is given when a minor progression actually reinforces, especially by a conjunction or opposition, planets which are engaged in a major progressed aspect. I'm just going to give this to you theoretically tonight. We're not going to actually work with these, but just so that you have an overview of the subject matter. So, when we're looking at a chart, natal, major progressions, and then the minor progressions are placed in the third wheel. And excuse me 1 minute, but I need to get some water. I'm losing my voice. All right, I'm back.
So here we have a minor progressed Mercury accentuating the ascendant by major progressions.
Yes, so what we would do is we would think of it as a reinforcement. If we had all of the progressions in front of us, we would look at, is the progressed ascendant in aspect? Now, as you know, if the folks online can't see any of this, I can't even see what's up here, and I'm standing pretty darn close to it. The resolution of this LCD projector is not so great. That's 22, major progressed ascendant is 22 degrees Aries. So we would look, is it involved in a major progression? If it was, and we're not going to put a lot of time into this, if it was, Laura, then the period of time that Mercury was in conjunction with that progressed aspect, that would be adding more soul energy or psychokinetic energy to the nature of the progressed aspect, to the major progressed, and then the 4 or more points that are being stimulated. So what this does is it's sort of like throwing another log on the fire. It heats things up a little bit more, and then if there were a transit that came along, it could work as a trigger for that event. For an event to be attracted by any of the 3 types of progressions, it's not necessary that any other type of progression contribute to it. But during the period a major progressed aspect is within the indicated distance from perfect, there will occur several brief periods when, due to the major progression of the moon or a minor progressed planet or both, several minor progressed aspects forming an aspect with one of the planets involved in the major progressed aspect. This is a long sentence. Was there any punctuation in there? There was no period thus far, is there? Ah.
There's a comma.
Yes, I'm grateful for that comma. So, the rest of that is one sentence. No, 2 sentences, which are given unusual accessory energy. That's what we're talking about. If you have a minor coming along while a major is in orb, it adds energy. If you have a transit coming along, it adds even more energy to that. It reinforces it. So there are periods of peak stellar activity happening in one's life, and this is where we look to see, when the trends are happening. And what he calls them is peaks of thought cell activity. Because remember, the way this is working is your unconscious mind is being stimulated to feel certain things. The third of the progressions that are used are called transit progressions. And basically, they are what are most commonly used, and basically Every year after birth is equal to 1 year of life. Every day after birth is equal to 1 day of life. And they don't require any complex mathematical formulas. You get an ephemeris, you track the planets for the day, and you follow them. That's what an ephemeris looks like. Usually it's done in a symbol, but we've got the positions of the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Usually there is a year marked August 2008, and then you have the date going down the side. So in an ephemeris, you could go across, find a particular day, and find the planetary positions for that day. That's how you can calculate transits.
In effect, you're comparing what the sky looked like at birth to what the sky looks like right now.
Correct.
Transits carry the power of 1/32 of the natal chart?
Yep. So transits aren't that important. There is an exception to the rule. Generally, they have about that much energy. But we consider them fairly insignificant in terms of power. Major progressions pack the power. Transits generally come along and trigger or unlock the energy that's in that major progression. The exception, as I said, is transits of slower moving planets, especially if they're going through angular houses, house number 1, 4, 7, and 10, and if they are forming conjunctions or oppositions to natal or major progressed planets. That's when they carry some noticeable energy. But in general, we'd say the power of a transit has about 1/32 of the energy that's locked into the natal chart. So, it's only gotten more complex. When we're looking at a transit chart, we're basically looking at planets which are in the outer wheel of the chart. This is the natal chart. These are the major progressions, the minor progressions, and the transits. So, we like to say that transits function as triggers. And what Zane says is there is no difference in the influence exerted by a major progressed aspect, minor progressed aspects, and transit aspects other than in the volume of energy supplied the stellar cells as indicated by the importance and magnitude of the event attracted. Oftentimes, people that work with transits will claim that it's the transit working, but you'll actually see the transit is reinforcing the major progression, which if the major progression wasn't in orb, you wouldn't have the event of a magnitude. Yes?
So would transits be something like a mental breakdown or breakthrough or something like that?
Those actually sound like significant events.
Really? 'Cause
Yeah.
they happen a lot for some people.
And in those people, they might be transits. If somebody is constantly having breakdowns or breakthroughs, then they're probably very unstable.
I have quite a few friends like that.
Well, and you're also a teenager, and that's a very...
Most of my friends are adults.
Oh, okay, well, then...
Progressions can last for a long period of time and have these transits trigger, sporadically.
Correct. Yeah, if you're looking at a major progression of Uranus, it could last your lifetime. And so it requires the minors and the transits to come along and trigger the event. That's when they become noticeable. what it is that those type of slower moving outer planets and aspects which last forever, probably those of you who have computers have programs that run on your computer in the background that you don't even notice.
Antivirus does that.
That sort of stuff. It's always there working in the background. It's not on your desktop. It's not something you're actually working in, but the program's constantly working on your computer. And that's what those really slow lifetime progressions are like.
We even find that when we look at current astrology, like the fact that Uranus and Pluto are squaring each other for, a year and a half, 2 years during this period of time. And then when other transiting planets come into orb of that, it accentuates the events that are associated with that big, slow-moving square.
Right. It's like the big aspect is like a fault line for somebody who comes from LA. And the others are like the little minor tremors that come along, but they can trigger a cataclysmic event because the pressure's already on that fault line. So here's the visual description I like to use. The major progression is the keg of dynamite. This is what carries the power. The fuse is the minor progression. The transit is the match. Which has more energy tied in with it, the keg of dynamite or the match? And I would disagree, because the match itself will not make the explosion, but the keg of dynamite will. So the match just comes along to set off this bigger thing which is already in place. That's the relationships of major progressions to minors and to transits. Now, the other thing we want to know when we're looking forward in a chart and trying to determine, is this good or bad, that what's going to happen to me, is what is the conditioning energy? Aspects from Venus bring 1/4 harmony with them. Aspects from Jupiter are conditioned with 1/2 harmony. Mars has 1/4 discord, and Saturn has 1/2 discord. So whenever these planets are involved in a progression, Venus will bring gifts, Jupiter brings things in abundance, Mars tends to bring strife, and Saturn tends to bring these very dutiful or laborious situations to us. The rest of the planets are all neutral. So what we have to do is we have to look at how are they functioning in the natal chart and what is the nature of the aspect by progression. Conjunctions, in the natal chart we call them prominence compound. It's the same by progressions when you have conjunctions. These are things that stand out in your life. These are big life events. Oppositions tend to bring separation. Likewise, by progressions, when you have a progressed opposition, these are big events, but they usually involve something being ripped away from you. So we have aspects which are neutral. The inconjunct, the parallels, the conjunction is neutral. They have varying degrees of power, from very mild to very powerful. There are harmonious aspects, which are the semi-sextile, the sextile, the trine, from mild harmony to moderate harmony to great harmony. And we have discordant aspects, from semi-square, sesqui-square, square, opposition, going from mild discord to moderate discord to great discord. So when we're looking at progressions, we want to know what type of aspect is involved, because this determines whether the event is going to bring friction, agitation, obstacles, or separations into the individual's life. Yes?
Do we have to remember all of the symbols?
If you want to learn astrology, you do. You have to remember the symbols for the aspects, the nature of all of the houses, the symbols for the planets, and the symbols for the sign. Because astrology uses a jargon or a specialized language, and it's written in shorthand, because it's easier to write that than to write OPPOSITION. We're making one symbol or one letter rather than a series of them. So it's shorthand. It makes the process easier. But for the beginning student, it can be very daunting. The advantage you have being so young, I started studying this when I was 13. And I was able to commit all of that to memory fairly easily because young brains are flexible and easily influenced.
Actually, a lot of the symbols make sense too.
Right.
If you look at them, that 45-degree angle is half.
Is a 45-degree angle.
Right, exactly. And the asterisk divides a circle into 6. So
Correct. That would imply
makes sense.
things. They all make sense, and they're shorthand. They are shorthand for a concept.
Pizza, because pizza's harmonious.
There.
Is everyone very happy?
Good.
Mildly harmonious.
Until you end up fighting over the last piece.
Then somebody gets soda all over it.
Or until you've put on 50 extra pounds and are having trouble getting up off the couch, then the pizza was not so harmonious.
Fat but happy.
All right. I'll accept that. So again, we look back to the natal chart. What is the conditioning of this planet in the natal chart? Because chances are the pattern in the future is going to replicate that. The way we read that, and we touched on this in the last couple of weeks, is through astrodynes, which actually calculate the power for the planets, signs, houses, aspects, and they're listed from the strongest to the weakest. We can see the percentage of power that that planet holds in any given chart, and then how that is, conditioned, whether it's greatly harmonious or whether it is highly discordant. It gives us key information. We know in this person's chart, when they have progressed aspects with Uranus, more than likely it's bringing disruptive events into their life. But when they have progressed aspects to Jupiter, they're having big opportunities. When we looked at this person's chart before, under that progressed trine from the Sun to Jupiter, this was a victory.
So this is still alive.
Yeah. All right, some things to know. Major progressions of the moon, approximately 50 days. A progression of the sun lasts for 2 years. It's a year it enters, it takes a year to reach perfect, and then it takes a year for it to leave. Mercury and Venus are approximately 18 months. Now again, if they go retrograde during that time period, it all changes. But 9 months into perfect aspect, 9 months leaving. The Mars aspects can last up to 3 or 4 years, depending on the speed that Mars is moving by progression in the chart. Jupiter progressions last between 9 to 11 years. That's something we might like to know. However, Saturn progressions can be 15 or more years, something we don't look forward to, because Saturn progressions bring very arduous times in our lives. The other planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, you don't want to know, because it's probably your entire lifetime. Now, the importance of the event that is attracted into the individual's life is dependent on the intensity of their thought cell activity. So, I do have a quote here. Which says, in predicting what events will be attracted into the life at a given time, therefore, the first thing to do is consider the normal composition and activity of the thought cells within the compartment of the astral body affected. What does that mean? Well, it's what house does the planet fall in? And what kind of energy does it carry? Then consider the volume, type, and harmony or discord of the energy added to the stellar cells within the compartment, and estimate not merely the amount of activity which will result from this new energy supply, but also how the new energy supply modifies or accentuates their normal feelings of harmony or discord. If you have in your natal chart 2 planets in square to one another, when they form a progressed trine, the nature of the trine is to add some harmony, but their natal capacity with one another is they're in conflict. So you have to, the astrologer has to be able to synthesize all of that information to describe to the individual the type of events they might attract. I like to, when I'm giving an interpretation of something like that, is give the best case scenario and the worst case scenario.
I'm just thinking of some of these planets that were together, like Pluto, Saturn. Both Laura and I were born with Pluto, Saturn conjunct. So that's not going to change our entire lifetime, is what you're saying, in a progression.
No. You were born at a time when the world had been through some of its greatest catastrophes. Not to give your age, but it was the Second Great War, or shortly thereafter.
It was the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Okay.
2 years later.
Right.
2-year anniversary of that. So.
But they had been in orb prior as well. But there was definitely that energy in place at that time.
So we were born into that and we're probably staying
Right,
there.
yeah, because what was going on after the Second World War, there was this, much like after the Civil War, there was reconstruction going on around the world in all of those areas. Not only the nations themselves that had started the wars that were destroyed, Japan and Germany, but the nations they had invaded, Poland, Russia, France.
So we can look at it as a
Manchuria.
rebuilding.
Well, actually,
Rebuilding, yeah.
On a psychological level too, there was kind of the realization in the mass psyche of the hugeness of what atomic energy meant, dropping the bomb, taking responsibility for it, the start of the Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, everything was changed
Right.
with that, as people rocked what went on.
I mean, I live in a neighborhood where still on the first Friday of every month, I can hear air raid signals, which is something we were trained with because I live close to the base. It's something we were trained with as children, duck and cover. And
My dad grew up with that, and my mom.
yeah, I mean, I was born 10 years after the end of the Great War, and it was still imprinted in consciousness.
Didn't they keep doing that till like the 70s?
Well, they still do it in my neighborhood.
So how would that influence your astral, your inner self, even before you were born, that conflict and everything going on?
Well, I might like to think that some people were brought into the world at that time to try and heal that conflict, to create a consciousness where there is some wariness about the impact of mob consciousness, and or when one group or ethnicity or religion becomes vilified and what that impact could be. So perhaps people are born into those time periods and raised through that, the fear or whatever the consciousness is, because they become the components for change. That's one possible explanation. Or they may just live really screwed up lives because, they spent their childhood expecting the Russians to invade and enforce atheism. So
They grew up expecting to die.
yeah.
Well,
Kind of like how they train
Or be
kids
tortured.
nowadays what to do whenever somebody comes in and starts shooting everybody.
but look at what their generation did. We were the ones who started the war protests and the peace demonstrations. It was the 60s. It was me. It was Laura. It was all these people. And you probably never had such a huge amount of war protests as you did back in the 60s and 70s.
And I doubt that it will ever happen again, because if you look at my generation, they're just kind of blasé about everything.
Yeah, as long as they have music and TV and pizza, they'll be happy. Well, we were too in those days, but that was between demonstrations.
The biggest thing I've ever seen anybody of my generation protest about is pot's not legal. You can still get it on the side of the road, dude. Calm down.
All right. Yes. So, the other thing you need to know in progressions is that every aspect has its own event. The thing is, at any given period in our lives, we have all sorts of aspects going on. And, this is why you could get a job raise one day and the boyfriend leaves the next, because there are different things going on all the time in the chart. And some things we might see as catastrophes and other things as great blessings.
Other things are kind of neutral.
And other things are neutral. Yeah, your house got painted. Woohoo.
Parents divorce.
That's kind of neutral, huh?
Probably not for them. It may not have been for them, however. Oh, okay.
Christopher, that comment you made in passing a few minutes ago about providing people with a best case scenario and a worst case scenario when you see any given progression going on in their charts, that's a huge skill set to develop. That is an awesome talent.
Well, I like people to know they have choice.
But how do you choose a best case scenario and a worst case scenario?
Whatever pops into my mind using the symbol set that I'm trained to work with, which is a combination of planet, signs, houses, and aspects, and the vocabulary which they're associated with. And oftentimes what that does in the hands of a skilled professional is, as you're sitting and talking to someone, you may get vocabulary, images, feelings, pictures. It works differently for every person.
Can you give us an example or two?
When I pull up a chart with aspects, I'm not going to pull something out of my hat right now, but when we're actually looking at a chart and aspects, we could do that.
Too, doesn't it kind of seem like that sometimes the charts that have the most tension are the ones where the person does something because they want to resolve the tension. So when I look at a chart and I went, oh my God, what has this life been like? And then you realize they've achieved some things because it wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable.
I agree, absolutely. When I get a client who has a completely discordant chart with few harmodines in it, I will basically tell them, your chart's really discordant, but the good news in this is you've been brought forth to be a problem solver, and therefore, great opportunities and achievements are available to you, because the thing about pain is it pushes us into movement. The thing about ease is we want to stay in the hammock. But when you sit on the tack, you want to get up and pull that damn thing out of your ass. So you do something about it. And with the other painful life experiences we have, we are usually signaled that we aren't being successful. And the pleasurable experiences we have in every organism, if it has an abundance of food, a comfortable place to sleep, it's feeling successful, and it's not going to exert greater energy to make something different happen. It's a minimalization of an efficiency of effort takes place. But when suddenly, the crops are hard to find, we take off in transhumance patterns and move across the landscape, searching for, something to eat. And so it's actually, the more conflicted charts are, oftentimes the individual has been motivated into, modifying their lives in some way. But it comes out of being made uncomfortable and or making those around them uncomfortable. So, natal charts remain the same, but we progress the planets forward through the chart. We've talked about the 4 more areas. We look at the natal house positions, the progressed positions, and the houses. Again, the more is what signs do these planets rule and what houses are they on the cusp of. So I'm going to just skip through all of this because we've got about 40 minutes left, and I want us to actually do some hands-on stuff. If you know the houses in a chart, first house, physical body. Second house, your wealth. Third house, your private thoughts or studies. Fourth house, home, family. Fifth house, fun. Love, romance, children, games. Sixth house, your work and everything that goes with that, your coworkers, colleagues. Seventh house, the others in your life, be it partnerships or the public. The 8th house is other people's money, which is debt, taxes, credit. 9th house is one's higher mind or philosophies, their higher education and travel. 10th house is career, honor, reputation. The 11th house is friendships, groups, clubs, organizations. The 12th house we talked about as being psychic forces, secrets, inner space. So planets moving through those zones are temporarily stimulating activities in those areas.
Renee asked a question. She wanted to know if you've ever read Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil by
I haven't. All right. So, how do we know if the event is going to be fortunate or unfortunate? Basically, fortunate means we felt good. Unfortunate means we felt bad. Are we attracting pleasurable or painful events into our lives? And we look at the nature of the planet itself in the natal chart and what type of aspect is being formed at any given time. Remember, squares and oppositions, semi-squares and sesqui squares have a certain amount of pain, from mild pain to extreme pain, that they bring with them. And things such as semi-sextiles, sextiles, trines have a certain amount of pleasure they bring with them, from mild pleasure to extreme pleasure. Now, another thing in the interpretation, as we saw from the Astrodyne report earlier, planets carry a different weight in the chart. They have a different amount of stellar or astrological power. When 2 planets are forming an aspect by progression, it's good to know which planet is stronger in the natal chart, because more than likely, that is the planet that's going to be carrying the weight of the experience. You can also have progressed aspects and never have an event. And I remind, somebody may come to me and ask me about love. When am I going to have a relationship? And so we might look for Venus aspects or aspects to the 7th house. However, if that person is a shut-in that never leaves the house, their only opportunities might be FedEx or the guy that delivers the water.
Or somebody knocks their window out with a baseball.
There's a possibility, yes.
Yeah, a
Baseball is very
sinkhole
important,
develops
too.
under your bed.
Yeah.
I
So,
wonder what was going on in his chart.
so you can have an aspect. Is this a news story or?
Yeah.
It happened in Florida.
Oh, well, it always happens in Florida. They live on karst topography. The environment dictates. You know, you don't grow orchids in the Arctic Circle because it doesn't support that. So we always have to weigh in what's happening with what the environment. And if you live in Florida, you're living on limestone, and the groundwater with carbonic acid eats away at the limestone, and it forms sinkholes.
Yeah, this guy was in his bed and down he went.
Did he survive?
No.
Oh,
He said he could find the body.
6 feet.
it's very sad to hear that. Yeah, well.
That had to be a shitty death. You're just sitting there minding your own business, and then you
He
fall
was
into a
asleep.
hole
He
in
was
the
asleep.
ground.
He was
Kind of gradual, not so.
They showed a picture of it, and it wasn't even
That's the worst
a large
nightmare.
hole.
What
That
that
is
is,
really,
you don't even have
I mean,
pepper
it really
running there.
discrete edges, and it just,
Well, maybe it's really
That
deep.
section of the house is what? Bedroom.
his bedroom, it wasn't a large.
Yeah, those things defy, you know, those things have some cosmic, it's like being struck by lightning. What are the chances?
Depending on where you live.
Also, major progressions can attract events with no reinforcement from minors or transits. They carry enough energy. The major moon, minors, and transits help us to narrow the timing when we're looking for a specific event. We would say interpreting progressions is an art. You have to know who you are dealing with. And one of the things I do in class on occasion is I will bring in the chart of a cat, unbeknownst to the students, and have them interpret it. And then explain to them, well, you know, this is another species that we're talking about, and the type of events that we might have described, making assumptions about a person, may or may not affect this animal. It's the same. The reader has to take into consideration the level of education, what kind of life training a person has had. These are things that you can assess when you sit and meet with someone because their language alone informs you about them. But the more you have that information, the more you can direct your interpretation. You try to stay focused just on the planets involved. There are many astrologers that do what I call the kitchen sink. They see one thing in the chart, and it makes their mind jump to this, and to that, and to this, and to that. So they try and bring in everything into their interpretation. But it has to be kept simple. Look at the planets involved, and what is the nature, the characteristic of the planet, the aspect, and the house. All right, eliminate concepts that are improbable due to birth chart predispositions.
Like their general age, where they were born?
Those sort of things can be, but birth chart predispositions could be, let's say someone has a dominant Saturn. You might not say that, well, during this period of time, you're going to take up skydiving and hot air ballooning and rappelling down cliffs in Yosemite. Because there's a very good chance that ain't ever going to happen.
But somebody in Jupiter might do that.
Or Mars active. Mars-Uranus active might be naturally a daredevil and would do those sort of things. Then we look at, you consider the age of the individual. For example, unless we're living in India or in one of those freaky Mormon enclaves, a child of 12, you're not going to say they're going to get married, because that is improbable in other cultures during that age sequence. I have seen 80 and 90-year-olds get married, though. Oftentimes when people think they're beyond the pale of love ever happening to them, it can happen. So you have to determine what type of events are going to be most likely based on the sequencing of events in someone's life. Now, again, we're going back to growing orchids in an igloo. It's not going to happen. The environment does not allow it. So, or getting a date when you never leave the house. You know, the environment doesn't allow it. So you have to look at, you know, if you live in a ghost town in the Nevada desert, is opening a boutique a good idea?
Okay, so you're talking about the physical environment and not the environment of the child.
The physical environment. Does it support?
But that can change.
Yeah, but definitely it won't change that fast.
Like they could move to New York and open a boutique there.
Correct. You might have to change the environment in order for that event to be successful. This, Laura, is my best case, worst case. You have to give alternative explanations for any aspect. And we'll give samples of that shortly as we work on a chart. The other thing is, you're not helping someone if you just tell them something bad's going to happen to them. And it doesn't help. To counsel someone, you have to be able to point out what the pitfalls are, but also make suggestions in terms of what they can do about that. What kind of, whether to avoid it, or we can't always avoid things. And sometimes we only get skills if we actually go through an experience. So, you know, you don't learn to swim unless somebody actually dumped you in the pool at some point. And so there are times where we have to actually go through events, but we have to know how do we cope with that, or do we go like this or like this in order to keep our head above the water and not drown during the event. And that happens to many. You know, you're not always successful with the first unfamiliar experience you get involved in. So you've got to redirect people and give them some tools that they can work with. So here's the chart we're going to look at today. I thought, since it's his birthday today, Piet Mondrian, who was a Netherlandish painter.
And a pioneer of great mustaches.
Yes. So not a pioneer. They were very popular in those days. But let's talk about this man. He was at the forefront of modernist painting. And what I'm going to do is move from the podium back to the computer, and I'm going to bring this up, and we're going to look at the timing of events in his life and what the aspects were that were in orb at that time. So give me a moment here to exit. All right, his birthday's March 7th, but he was born in 1872, just a few years ago. One of the founders of the neoplasticism movement in art and a contributor to the de Stijl movement. Now, in 1892, Mondrian entered the Academy for Fine Art in Amsterdam. So what we want to do is to progress the chart Let's progress it to, let's say, the middle of the year. So 6/1/1892. This will bring up the progressions. What rules art in a chart? Venus or Neptune? Venus and Neptune. Neptune's the upper octave of Venus. So Neptune is that ability to imagine and translate, or to be able to work on visual arts. Venus is just the general love for the arts and the aesthetics. It's a little hard to see, but it looks clearer up there than it does on my screen. So what are some of the aspects? What about for education? What might we look for in a chart? We would look to activities involving the ninth house. So in his chart, what planets would stimulate the ninth house? There's nothing in there natally, and there's nothing in the ninth house by progression. So Pluto or Mars aspects would stimulate a course of study. What about the planet Mercury? Mercury is intelligence and study. So any aspects involving Mercury could also set one on a course of learning. So what's going on in his chart at this time? If we look at Mercury, it's at 22 Aries. Right, which is 22 Aries in the first house. Being in the first house, it's going to be something very personal. And clearly, this was an event that shaped his life. This man made art till he died. So
this would be about when he started going to the academy?
Yes.
At age 20?
This was, yes, at age 20, 1892, he entered the Academy for Fine Art in Amsterdam. So Mercury, the planet of intelligence, was conjoined with Neptune, the planet of vision, imagination. So that was, and it's in the first house of self and self-interest. So no doubt this was a moment of incredible self-discovery for this man. Now, if we're looking for also the university or the higher mind, we've got to look for aspects to the ninth house. Because it's an institution?
Right, well, higher education. It's like a university, a school, institution, yes.
Well, let's go with the ninth, and then let's look for aspects from Mars. By progression, Mars is at 19 Aries, so we can see it's forming a square to Saturn, which natally is at 19 Capricorn. So, was the process easy? Chances are it wasn't easy.
You probably had to butt heads with the conservative, traditional teachings of art. He was a real innovator and thinker outside the box.
Yeah, and clearly, if you look at the work he produced, it wasn't like anything before it. So.
Also, my
What about the relationship of progressed Mars to Jupiter? Also at 19 degrees. Saturn and Jupiter are exactly opposite one another in this chart. So Mars or Saturn brings 1/2 discord, Mars brings 1/4 discord, and Jupiter brings 1/2 harmony whenever they're in aspect. So we'd have to assume that his entry into the academy was probably stressful.
Self-expression.
And creativity.
That's what brought it in.
So the pleasure in this case may have outweighed the pain of the experiment. Plus, with the Mercury conjuncting Neptune, there's something going on at that time that's illuminating his mind. So there's an example of aspects. Now, if we were just looking at this chart, let's pick an aspect. Mercury conjunct Neptune. What's the best case scenario of that aspect? The mind united with the utopian images. This is a period in your life where things could become highly spiritualized. You could get a sense of your life mission. You might find... Initiate new idealism of some type.
Work, which is his artwork, so that would be a form of expression for him that he would initiate.
Now, what would the worst case scenario of this be? This is a period in your life where you might drink too much, or you might become...
Well, if he's Dutch, this all goes along in those, especially in that period, that people, anybody that went to the university, it was just chaos. See, and so that's what it's still today is the same way. Amsterdam, it's one party from the time you start school till when you leave. You think, oh my gosh, what did I do for the last 4 or 5 years?
So that's why they're all out cleaning their door stoops. Somebody threw up on their way home that night before.
He also had to hide part of himself. I mean, if he's trying to communicate, and Neptune's right there, it's like keeping it secret.
He was a very nebulous person, I think. He was very secretive about how he came up with the ideas of his work. He had like an umbilical cord to the universe. That's what I see.
I like that description, Johanna.
He might also have found that words were inadequate to express himself.
Right. So
he went to imagery and
that's right.
Geometrical, patterns, and he kind of, I think from what I know about him, was very reticent to interpret his own work in words. He wanted
Which
the
most
visual
artists
impact
are.
to carry
Right.
what he was, quote, saying.
All right, now let's look at another period in his life. We're going to progress this up to 1908. Okay, tools. Progress the chart. Let's go with...
So you know something that we don't know about what happened to him in 1908?
Yes, would you like me to share that with you?
After we look at the...
Oh, okay. I like that approach, Laura. Well, what's happening here in 1908? Here we have the Sun at 22 degrees of Aries, conjunct Neptune in the first house. And we have the planet Venus, which is part of his 12th house of what? Mysteries, secrets, inner life.
Also, hidden enemies.
Hidden enemies.
Frenemies.
But that Sun Neptune, he could be in the first house. He could be seen as bigger than life. That's almost like iconic.
Yeah,
What about mystical experiences in one's life?
Yeah. But I just see that the public sees, well, I mean, first house seems to be the way you introduce yourself. And so...
That may have been when he grew that mustache.
Look at my fancy mustache.
I mean, I just think of
Like when it's not
Madonna was
snort.
son in the
That's how he
12th house,
said
and
it.
instead of
I
using
was
it as a
born
victim, she used
Oh,
it
really?
Like when it's not
as
snort.
goddess.
That's mustache.
So you
It's
got
awesome.
it's just, he's got the sun, Neptune, must be as big as the mystical.
So progressed Venus,
He must have had some fame at this point.
27 Pisces. Look at natal Uranus and progressed Uranus, 27 Pisces. What does Uranus rule?
He might have gotten
Sudden
like,
changes.
recognized
Ahead
for
of
being a revolutionary
Yeah,
artist.
he might have gotten some honor, some significance, some clout
For being an outside of the box emperor, finally.
Not in that time, not till he died.
Yeah, and I think Johanna's correct on this.
Oh.
But what did happen in 1908 is he encountered theosophy and anthroposophy,
What is that?
the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, and the teachings of Blavatsky. So what happened at that point in his life is his artwork became influenced by this more occult and or mystical vision of the world. These are things that started to shape this man's personality and his life view.
But did that bring him into the spotlight too, a little bit of fame?
It may have. I don't know his life completely, so I don't know everything that happened that year. But I am looking at some very specific life events. I do know this happened that year.
But he was a very motivated person in the art world. So, because all the planets, most of them are on the east side of the chart, and it also to himself, I see, as a personal development, spiritual as well as material. It was like a surprise to him that he came up with all those, ideas that just seemed to come flowing into his mind.
Right, and for him, it came about through disparate disciplines. He was trained in the classical arts. They weren't doing this kind of art in Amsterdam at that time. They were, studying the classicist. And he combined that with the concepts that entered his life through a totally different discipline, which was, mysticism and occultism. And from these great disparate modalities of thinking, he generated this whole other grid work of imagery that became his signature. And he was, 36 years old at this time.
When you work with color, and coming from an artist's point of view, it opens up all kinds of different things. See, you could be working with a certain color and all of a sudden you get an idea about something.
Right, because color is vibrational.
It's vibration. And so when you're working with this constantly, you just enter a totally different
You
world.
enter an altered reality. Now,
Where he has his Uranus setting, is that the environment in which he was actually doing his art? Could
that
it
would be his studio.
Probably
Okay,
on a
so,
houseboat.
and the influences in that studio, Uranian, so
He probably had a few quirky friends coming by, because remember, what happens under Uranus aspects? The unexpected, but also things come about through what we call a human agency. These catalytic events are usually sparked by somebody who becomes the yeast in our dough, so to speak. So with Uranus there, I imagine there were other people that were part of this, Distill movement or the neoplasticism that was going on at that time. That there was yeast coming into the dough.
The underground of art. See, it was a new aspect of art.
And that's Uranus for you. It's that avant-garde movement. It comes through the planet Uranus. So he's 36 at this time.
Probably lived in a houseboat.
I would say, you know, in the water.
I actually think he had a studio. No, I think it was in a, at least the photos I've seen of it it was terrestrial. But who knows? He may have lived in a houseboat. It's hard to imagine artists living separate from their work, but
Maybe he actually just spent a lot of time around the water. Because I know that a lot of people will walk a couple miles even to get to the nearest lake and just hang out there.
yeah, in Amsterdam you don't have to do that. You go, you step out the door, and you're on the canal.
Do we know whether he was gay?
I could find no historic evidence of that, but there's also no evidence of any other relationships. So,
Just like old man Fritz.
yeah.
Trining Uranus, you know, that could be an expression of
Unconventional romance happening at that time, something that's outside the edge of acceptable, behavior in the culture.
His artwork was his love. That was his love.
Let's move on just because of time. I want to go to another period, just so we can see how aspects work. So, let's progress the chart now to 1938. What was going on in Europe at this time?
War.
Advancing fascism. So, how do you think he may have reacted to that? He moved.
Well,
So,
I can say it's
for a move, what kind of aspects do we need for a move? I'm going to keep you all focused for the next 7 minutes. For a move, what do you need an aspect to? Thank you. So, if we look at the fourth house, the ruler is Mercury because we have Gemini on the cusp. But by progression, the ascendant's moving through there. So if the ascendant forms an aspect, that could bring about a change of home. So, the ascendant, 27. Where have we seen that degree before? So, the aspect from 27 Gemini to 27 Cancer is what? 30 degrees, one sign apart. A semi-sextile, which is a mildly favorable event. Well, where did he go? Very good.
London.
Why would he do that one?
because he was probably Jewish.
It was the closest.
Would have been the better option.
No.
The Swiss weren't letting people in for the most
They
part.
wouldn't let
The
people in.
borders were
So he's
closed.
probably Jewish, so he had to move to London or he'd have been killed.
Or he was gay. But what it really was is the fact that he was doing an art form which the fascists looked upon as being, they had a word for it. It was, what kind of art did they call it?
degenerate.
Degenerate art. Thank you, Laura. This was known as degenerate art. It was something that did not glorify the human form. So the real reason for his moving may not have been Jewish ancestry or unconventional romances, but the fact that as an artist, he could not follow his chosen art form in a fascist world because the fascists gathered up all of what they called the degenerate artist and collected their works, and they would have exhibits of degenerate art to show to the public how these horrible artists were eroding the fabric of European society.
That after the degenerate art got so popular, they just squelched it then. And so it wouldn't have.
This is
So-
phase.
As far
This
as
is
why.
phase.
But they did put on a couple of shows which showed this. And so Mondrian went where? To London, because that's about the only place you could get to at that time. It wasn't that, it was 26 miles away practically across the English Channel. And again, the U.S. was not opening its doors to Europeans at that time. So that came later, however. 2 years later,
Pay their way in, so.
Oh, of course, but isn't that the way it's always been?
Yeah.
all right, 1940, another move, London to Manhattan. What are we looking for? Aspects for a move are either going to be the ascendant or Mercury. The ascendant because by progression, it's moving through the fourth house. Mercury because the fourth house of the home is ruled by Gemini. So, Mercury is at 0, Taurus, and the ascendant is at 29, Gemini. So there was at that time a sextile which we consider to be a very favorable aspect. Yes. Why? Because he had a patron in New York that paid his way in, set him up in a studio. And so from this, the semi-sextile was good in that it got him out of mainland Europe. And abruptly. Right. It was abrupt. And then this was good because it was planned and it was sponsored. However, February 1st, all right, February 1st, 1944. So this would have made him, what, 72 almost? Just short of 72. He dies. So we would normally look for aspects involving the 8th house. We could look for the aspects involving the 4th house, the end of things, or anything involving one's personal vitality, which is the sun. And at this time, he had a Mars-Sun conjunction in his chart. And so the energy of that, I'm not sure what he died of, but I would guess from that it may have been, it could have been probably heart disease or an infection. But yes, Mars, Sun, or an accident with the 3rd house involved. A heart attack in the back of a taxi. Short trips down a flight of stairs.
That's right. That's right.
So, there you have it. That's how progressions work. I forget what we're doing next week. I think we're going to start alchemy next week, which is how do you look at a chart and give some helpful advice. So, more to come next week. See you all then.
Okay.
And goodbye to all of you who are online. Thanks for sharing with us tonight.